what would you have said have been visible advantages that we've already seen from Brexit so far?
One thing I noticed in Sainsbury's the other week, a product which had a New Zealand flag on, which I think is evidence that we have better trading arrangements with. We're starting to source food from where we used to before we joined the European Economic Community, I think it was called in the beginning.
Is that the only advantage that you've noticed so far?
It's the one which first comes to mind. I'm sure I could find more if I look.
And what does national conservatism mean to you?
It means taking pride in one's history, one's culture.
I think that national conservatism mostly relates to the fact that we should see the nation state as the primary political unit of foreign affairs. And I don't think that this is an extremist or even a radical idea at all. It's been, this concept has been with us since the Treaty of Westphalia centuries ago. And I definitely think that people should look at national conservatism with a more open mind.
I'm here because I find that an event like this is really important. To gather together conservatives, and especially as an academic, being a conservative is very much a minority position. You sometimes find yourself surrounded by people who are not only hostile to you, but you find yourself sometimes in an environment where you can't really find fellow conservatives.
I am an ardent supporter of Brexit because I believe that if you don't have sovereignty, you don't have a nation. If you don't have borders, you don't have a nation.
Ultimately, the European Union in Britain is unconstitutional, right? And it's obviously very difficult to say something is necessarily unconstitutional when you don't have a written codified constitution. But it is unconstitutional because it undermines the sovereignty of Parliament, because parliamentary sovereignty is the basis of the British Constitution. The idea that Britain's Parliament can make, abolish or amend laws as it chooses.
But do you think Brexit's actually working now? Do you think it is better off?
No, because if you have incompetent people running your country, then it's irrelevant whether or not you leave the European Union. And at the time, I was a bit younger and I was a bit more naive about how strong Britain was on her own. I still think Brexit was good, and I still think that leaving the European Union gives us the opportunity, but it's about what you do with that opportunity that matters.
Do you think that Brexit's helped with immigration?
I think that Brexit hasn't been fulfilled to its fullest potential, to be perfectly honest. And I think one of the challenges facing the government is how much is attributed to Brexit. I think one area it does help with is our ability to create and maintain new laws, and our ability to not always be looking to Europe for guidance. And that was something that, as a Brexiteer myself, that I believe very strongly in, which was the principle of sovereignty, of being able to reclaim our borders, essentially.
I think we still have to give it time to play out. Everything certainly hasn't been sorted out. And, something as monumental as dialing back Brexit, we can't judge in, this immediate time right after.
It's still been it's been quite a while though since Brexit was.
I still feel that it needs time to play out.
You said that there are people who aren't doing a very good job at getting Brexit done. Who are those people?
The incompetent people. Specifically, I don't think a lot of this has to do with the pandemic, and I'm not going to allow that. I'm not going to certainly say that, but I think we have certain people in government who essentially don't appreciate the importance of freedom. I would say Boris Johnson is one of those people.
But he was like he was the biggest in terms of being a Brexiteer.
So he supported Brexit. At the same time, he had an opportunity for a few years. Now, there was a pandemic. and the pandemic ended up not being as bad as people thought, yet he still locked down the countries, he still suppressed our freedoms. Nothing really much was done on trade. And you know, with President Trump, Britain had the best opportunity it can ever hope for with an incredibly pro-British president of the United States. Yes, America first was a thing, but America first isn't America only. And you had an opportunity to strike a deal. The British government never did that.
So would you say that, for example, Suella Braverman, do you think she's doing a good job at the moment in tackling immigration?
I'm not going to weigh in on that because it's not the politics of my country.
Personally, I think that a culture can definitely be enriched by immigration. And while some communities have not assimilated into society as much as others, I don't necessarily believe that stopping immigration, especially legal immigration, is something that would bring us much benefit. I believe in preventing illegal immigration from becoming much more well spread as it is today. I believe that aspect should have been prevented, and I believe that we can put some measures in place that can prevent people from making the dangerous journeys that they make to arrive here in the UK and in other Western countries. But at the same time, I definitely agree that immigration has its economic and social benefits.
So to me, woke, I think, is a very, very misused and abused term. I think it started out as meaning someone who was awake to different ideas, and it's become a sort of umbrella term which is used for any number of social engineering tactics that the left use to try and normally embed some form of victimization. And in my head, it's a very negative form of expression. Normally it belongs in the area of identity. It can creep into the way people see the world, how they try to redefine basic scientific facts. We've had a lot of issues with the term woke in the area of biology. I think one of the things we have to do is we have to remember. Well, that's particularly in terms of, you know, politicians being able to define what a woman is.
The idea of change isn't necessarily bad for me, but it's something that I've always proceeded with caution in my life. That things are as they are for a reason, for a purpose, that nothing is really random, that everything is structured and ordered in a specific way by, you know, throughout the generations.
Woke is a term that has been popularized in recent times by many people on the right to sometimes rightfully, sometimes less so, counteract the narratives that the left is putting out about national culture or about some of the other socially progressive policies that I'd like to see implemented.
A lot of the rights we have, you know, come from God, and that makes the idea of a right absolute and not subject to some ideology or individual subjective belief, but it's something that is thrusted upon us as rights. But I think the idea, but in terms of women's rights, it's a difficult one because, A, we have to talk about what rights are, but also which women want certain rights and right to do what, and what the purpose of these rights are, and what do they actually achieve.
For example, like the royal family's links to slavery, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think what is not taught in schools is that the West and Europe were really among the first to repudiate slavery, and England, as I believe, was the first to actually abolish slavery and really focus the Navy, and that's a decade or so before we did so in my own country. But even in my own country, we fought a bloody civil war where there was much bloodshed in the cause of abolition of slavery. And so I feel that they've got it wrong if they don't know that side of it.
And to say that just because the traditional way of men going out and working and women staying at home, that these societies that practice that, women are oppressed. I mean, we're told in the narrative, and this goes back to what Dr. Starkey was saying about bad history. We have a lot of bad history around where suddenly all societies in the past, because women didn't vote, because women didn't do this, because men only did this or men did this, suddenly these societies were evil or inherently bad.
Drag Queen Story Hour, which is something that's been promoted a lot in this country and started in the US, where children are brought by their parents to experience drag shows, to experience drag queens, reading to them, occasionally dancing provocatively or wearing a thong around them or whatever it might be. And to me, that sort of sexualization of children is a provocative experience that they shouldn't have to go prior to adolescence.
You don't think that women were oppressed?
We look back 100 years ago. I don't look back, but some people look back 100, 200 years ago. Women couldn't vote. Women couldn't serve as heads of banks or whatever. It must have been oppressive back then. Well, I don't, because, I'm a student of history. I understand how societies are and how people do things. If you want to look at where women are oppressed, look to many countries in the Middle East where women are forced to wear things, where women are not allowed to vote, or women don't have access to education.
From your perspective as an American looking onto the UK, how do you think the Conservatives are doing at the moment, if you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, well, I've recently met many bright lights to my great satisfaction within the Parliament. And I think they would all do well to heed the message of this conference, which is be courageous and stand up for what is right. And what we know, and what I imagine should inspire the Tories, is to preserve their culture and long-held values, because that's truly what's made not just this country great, but has made the Anglosphere great. And we lost it a bit because we've started to apologize for it. And that's the wrong way to go. So if there's anything to come out of that, I'm very hopeful that this conference gets a lot of coverage and that people are inspired by that.
In the 1980s, we were the party of people who aspired to own their own homes. I worried that now we're becoming the party of people who already do.
What do you mean by that?
It's too difficult to get on the property ladder these days. I mean, there are reasons behind that we can't control, but there are reasons there are things we can do.
It's not so much about whether or not the Conservative Party can win or lose. I think they're in a very, very difficult spot at the moment, and I'm not confident fully that they can pull together in time for the next election. Do I want to see a Labour government? Not at all. I think that Starmer is the kind of person who backtracks on a lot of what he says.
Keir Starmer is certainly no Tony Blair. The people he has behind him are pretty anonymous. But I mean, it's difficult winning an election after 13 years in power. And now that they're not led by basically a communist, it's going to be harder.